Eslint is the GOAT when it comes to linting your code, and it's critical for not only making sure that your code looks good, but works the way that it's supposed to with static analysis. Now, Prettier kind of took over from where Eslint left off and built a tool specifically designed around formatting, meaning it's going to be a lot faster, and it also comes with its own set of opinionated configurations, so you don't have to waste a bunch of time on a pull request arguing whether or not you need a semicolon. Spoilers, you do. But we have an upgrade on our toolchain where now we have Biome built on top of Rust that promises to be much faster than Prettier. Now to see how this works, I'm going to use an existing project where I have my image to XYZ app right here, which is just a free image optimizer and converter, where it's just a Next.js project that already has Eslint set up, but that Eslint is just simply the Next.js configuration. But I want to give Biome a try, so let's get started and see how we can get this set up. Where under installation, we can see that using our favorite package manager, I can go ahead and just simply copy the command. And then inside my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and run npm install biome. And back over inside the configuration, we can see that we're going to want to initialize Biome inside of our project. So we get this npx init command, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And again, paste that inside of my terminal. And if I go ahead and expand this, we can see that it gives us a few first steps in order to get started, where we have primarily setting up our editor. We can try a command. We can migrate from Eslint or Prettier. We can read the docs, or we can get involved with the community. Now, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to step 3 to start off with, because I already have an Eslint config, and that's probably my most important thing right now for me. And if we again look at the Eslint file, we can see that it is that default Next.js settings like we saw before. Now, if I'm installing an opinionated formatter or linter, I kind of have two options where I can kind of just start from scratch if I want. Maybe I want to just adhere to the opinionated rules that Biome has, which is probably really good and well thought out. Or alternatively, if I already tried to configure a lot of my settings, like if we want to use the Next.js settings as they are, we can try to migrate those over. Now, if we look inside of the documentation, we can see that they give us a tool to help us out with that, where we have the biome migrate command, where we pass in either Eslint or Prettier, where in our case, we're using Eslint. We then use the write command to make sure that it writes those configurations. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that first line because I'm using Eslint and head over to my terminal. And before I add the biome command, I want to make sure that I add npx in front of that so that it can try to find that package within my project. Otherwise, I can add it as a script inside of my package.json, but we're only going to use it once, so that probably doesn't matter that much. But now if I paste in the rest of the command after that and try to run that, if I hide myself here, we can see that, we actually get an error when we're trying to run this. Now, this is actually a known issue inside of the Biome project, and I'm not totally sure about what the issue underlying is, but they do give a solution where we can see that if we open up a package inside of our node modules, specifically the Eslint config next, and we just simply comment a line, which sounds a little bit sketchy, but just for migration purposes will probably be fine, we can see that we can actually successfully run it. So let's give this a try. So if we go inside of node modules, then Eslint config next, and then index.js, we can comment out this rush stack line. And again, this is only if you're using Next.js or run into a similar issue, as this apparently is an issue in other projects as well, but let's see what this looks like. So if we look under the node modules folder, and I found my Eslint config next, I went to the index.js and I comment out that line, and where my biome.json originally looked like this, if I now try to run that migration again, we can see that it updated in the background where I now have that full configuration, which came from the Next.js Eslint config. Now, again, it's probably arguable about whether or not you need to go into the effort to do that. We do have some nice rules in here, particularly around the ally side, but those are things that you can always configure as you're moving along. But now that we have this configuration set up, now let's actually disable Eslint inside of the project because we don't want them running or conflicting against each other. So I'm going to look inside of my package.json file and find everything that has Eslint. So we have the Eslint package itself, we have the Eslint config next, and it looks like those are the only ones that I have in here. So let's get started actually removing those. So in my terminal, I'm going to npm uninstall Eslint and Eslint config next. Then back inside my project, all that's left to do is actually delete that eslint.json file. And I'm just going to do a double check Eslint, make sure that there's nothing else inside the project, no other Eslint files, and I think we're good to go for removing Eslint. So now let's actually see how we can run this thing. We're under getting started, under usage, we have a couple different options, including formatting, we have linting, and then we have check, which can run both. Now, if we look inside of this command, when we run it, we can run check or linting and formatting, and we can use the write command, as well as specify which files we want to actually apply this to when we're configuring this. So inside of my package.json file, I'm going to set up the scripts needed in order for me to run this. Now, I already have a lint command because Next.js comes out of the box with that. So if I go ahead and remove the next lint and replace that with biome check, and then I want to specify the files that I want to apply this to, where let's just start off by using the source directory. If I now run npm run lint inside of my terminal, we can see that I do get a bunch of errors already because it looks like I'm failing to adhere to a lot of the standards of the tool. So now let's actually take this a step further and then format our document. So I'm going to go ahead and just clone this line. I'm going to change it to format. And then instead of just simply check, I want to also add the right inside of there. Where now if I again run npm run format, this time it's actually going to go through and format everything that it would consider a safe fix. Now expanding this out and we can actually start to look through this, we can see that it still gives us a lot of warnings. These are things that it does recommend, but it's not going to fail the linting process in order to just make sure that you fix this. But these are still good things that we need to consider as we're working through making sure that we have good code health. Like here, it's making sure that we have the appropriate dependencies set up inside of a hook. Now, another way that we can handle formatting is we can also install an extension where if we're using VS Code, for instance, or IntelliJ or Zed, we have a plugin available for us to actually install. Now we can see here under first party plugins, but if I scroll down to the bottom on the left-hand side, we can see that I have a VS Code extension page that walks through how I can actually install this, where to get started, it's just simply available in the extension marketplace. Or if I come back and go Command Shift P again, and I install extensions, and then I look for Biome, we can see that it pops up at the top. Make sure it's biome.js. I'm going to go ahead and click install, and we can now have that available for us. Now, as far as the settings for the extension is concerned, we can see that the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually set it up as a formatter. Now, you can kind of do this on the fly if you want, as you're trying to use the format command and configure the default as you're working through it. But we can also set up our VS Code settings inside of the project. So whenever somebody is using VS Code inside of this project, they can see that file and have a similar setup to make sure everybody's using the same formatter. So for instance, here we can create a settings.json file and configure our default formatter. So inside of the root of the project, I'm going to create a new folder called .vs code. Inside that, I'm going to create a new file called settings.json. Then I'm going to go ahead and paste in that snippet where we can see that it's setting up a default formatter where we can specify what that is. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that for now, but we're also saying that if it's a JavaScript file, we're going to set the default formatter as Biome. Now, Biome doesn't support formatting every single document type that there is, but it does support most of the ones that we're going to work with. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to just set this as the default formatter and run into issues as I hit them and then configure them along the way. So as I have my default formatter, I'm going to hit pretty much all my use cases that I'm going to need inside of my Next.js app. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all save that. And if I open up one of my page files, I can hit Command Shift P, I can go to Format Document, and we can see that, well, in this case, it didn't do anything because this file was already formatted when we initially ran it. But let's say, for instance, I add a bunch of spaces, which it's not going to like. I'm going to break this up a little bit, and then I try to run format again. We can see that it corrected all those formatting issues that I had added, similar to if we had run it on the command line. Now, not only can you set it up to use those commands, you can also set it up so that whenever you hit save, it formats automatically. So we can see that we have two things here that we want. We want to have the format as well as the fix. So we're going to want to set this format on save value, which we're going to set to true, a Boolean. And we're going to also set up this code actions on save so that we can use the quick fix of Biome. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and copy editor format on save. I'm going to paste that in as an option and make sure I set that to true. And then I'm going to also copy in the editor code actions on save, where it's quick fix Biome set to explicit. Now, if I go to my page.tsx file, which I similarly messed up like I did before, and I go ahead and hit save, we can see that all the formatting was again applied. Now, as we're working through this, there's one thing that's pretty important that you should consider as you're working through any kind of formatter or linter that you're adding to the project. And that's how your Git is going to look as you're trying to push out this commit or your pull request. Now, if I head over to my terminal and run git status, we can see that I have changes to a ton of different files. This might be every single file that I have inside of my application. Now imagine if I coupled those changes with a bunch of actual real changes inside of a pull request. I'm going to be giving somebody a really hard time for trying to review that pull request. So try to have some consideration and maybe create a pull request dedicated specifically to the formatting so that you can completely keep those separate to real changes that you're actually going to push into your application code. You also want to consider maybe have a bunch of people on your team working on the project at the same time. It probably makes sense not to have this long lasting. Otherwise, you might have a bunch of conflicts as you're working through the project with the team. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of how this is all working, of how we can actually apply the formatting and linting, let's look at how maybe we can custom configure what this looks like. Now we're here talking about linting and formatting. If you're ready to build a full stack Next.js 15 course, complete with authentication, database management, and accepting payments, make sure you head over to spaceshelly.dev/nextjs to get exclusive access and updates for my upcoming course. Now, one thing that the default formatting settings did that you might be totally against depending on your viewpoint is it just turned all my spaces into tabs. Shocked face. Now, of course, you can configure whether or not you use tabs or spaces. So for instance, under the formatter property, we can set the indent style to either tab or spaces. We can even set the indent width. So if I go ahead in my settings, my biome settings, and set up the formatter, and I set the object, where if I now set up my indent style, I can set that to space. And now just to make sure that this works, if I go ahead and manually run that format document, I can see that now I have back my beautiful spaces. And I still personally prefer spaces. I just like working with it a little bit better. It's what I'm used to right now, but there are a lot of good and compelling reasons of why you should consider tabs. Now, another one that I like to use is the unused imports. I like to make sure that if I clean up my code or refactor it or something, if I have a leftover import, it gets cleaned up as I'm working through this. So say for instance, I have import get CLD image URL from next cloudinary. We can see that I'm not currently using this inside, but I want to make sure that that's cleaned up if I'm not using it inside of the document. So we can see that we have this no unused import setting that we can configure to make sure that it cleans that up whenever we save or run that formatting. Now heading over to my biome.json file, this one's going to be under correctness. So if I set up my no used unused imports, I can set that to either error or warn, really kind of depending on how I want it to be configured. But if I set it to warn, for instance, and I head back to my page.tsx file, I can see that I do now get that nice yellow squiggly line letting me know that it is an issue. Now, of course, as far as formatting is concerned, this is considered a safe fix. So if I do try to add a space just to kind of trigger it again and hit save, we can see that it was removed. Now, what do I mean by safe fix? Now we can see this note here. This rule is specified as a safe fix, meaning it's determined that if I format that on save and it removes it, it's considered safe and that it's not going to break something. Some rules aren't necessarily safe to remove, as because there can cause issues with the code and cause it to break, but others Biome is confident that it's not going to break something, such as the no unused imports, so it deems it as safe. Now, as we're working through this configuration, one thing I also noticed is that whenever we imported those Eslint styles, it set my linter rules as of recommended to false, where it's not going to inherit all those recommended rules from Biome. So one thing, I want to use all those recommended rules, and then I can place whatever else is on top of that. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that set is true, but that's really depending on how you want it to be set up. Now, another one that you might like to add is use sorted classes, where especially if you're using something like Tailwind, it's going to be able to sort all of the classes that you have applied to an element in the same order every single time. So imagine with Tailwind, if you have 100 different elements and you have 100 different ways for how you actually define the order, this is going to be really helpful because you'll then have some more predictability of where to look in that order for the different classes for how you're styling it with Tailwind. Now, this one's unique for two reasons. First of all, it's ruled as an unsafe fix. So we need to tell the formatter that we want to use it even if it's unsafe whenever we're formatting. It's also part of what is considered a nursery group, which means it's still kind of new and it's still being worked in progress. So under our linter and then rules, we're going to create a new category called nursery. And inside there, we're going to add our use sorted classes definition, where again, because of the state of this, we need to add a little bit more configuration. So I'm going to specify the level of error first of all, and then I'm going to define the fix as safe, meaning I'm telling it that I want it to be considered as safe so that it can go through and actually format for me. Now, as you can see, we get this squiggly line on the use sorted classes because we need to define an options object, even though we're not going to actually define any options. But if we head back to that page.tsx file, we can see, for instance, and I'm just going to add a space so that I can think it into us having made a change. We can see that now we have squiggly lines on all these because they're not sorted appropriately. Well, it looks like we have one that is, but for the most part, these can be sorted in a better way. So if I go ahead and hit save, we can see that these were all sorted for me, and now they're going to be in a more predictable way. Now, there's a ton of rules that you can explore throughout this, such as no console logs. So maybe you want to automatically remove all the console logs as they're getting committed. Or there's also organized imports so that if you like them having in the same ABC order each time, even if they're in the same group, you can have that set up. But let's move on to another piece. If you're familiar with the concept of GitHub pull requests, one feature that is really killer is the concept of actions, where we can define custom GitHub actions inside of our project to run every single time that we perform a specific action to the actual repository. Where, for instance, if we create a pull request or if we push code, we can automatically run things like tests, or we can also run linting. Biome documentation has a bunch of recipes for working with CI, and it has one specifically for working with GitHub Actions. So we can see here that it's defining this action for when we submit a pull request or whenever we push, it's going to go ahead and it's going to set up and run Biome for us using its own custom hook that it published, and it's going to go ahead and run that for us. So let's give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. And back inside of my project, I already have this .github folder, and I already have a workflow under the workflows folder. This is something completely separate. This is for cleaning up the media that gets uploaded into this particular project, but I want to create a new workflow. So I'm going to add, let's just call it code quality.yaml. You can really name that whatever you want for whatever your purposes are, but I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, and we can see that we have our code quality GitHub action with all of our configuration that we just copied in from the actual project. Now, without adding any additional settings, what this is going to do is it's going to check out our repository. Again, it's going to set up Biome using its own GitHub action, and then it's going to run Biome in CI settings on this project. Now, I don't want it to run on everything. I only want it to run on the source. But as soon as I push that file out and GitHub sees it, we can see that we have a new check that just started. We have our code quality check. And if I go ahead and navigate to that, we can see that it's already starting to work through this. And we can see that it's already getting flagged for issues because it's not completely formatted the way that the configuration is set to be. Now, the handy thing about this is imagine if you have an open source project or any kind of project that you're accepting code from anywhere, or maybe you're a team that has a bunch of developers and you want to make sure everybody adheres to the same formatting standards. If they push this pull request, Biome is automatically going to run, so you don't have to have any of those conversations like we talked about earlier, where you're arguing over the different code styles. It's adhering to the code standards that you configured inside of the biome.json file, and it has to pass those in order for the pull request to get merged. Now, just to show another option inside that workflow, if you're already using workflows for things like testing, running your builds, or whatever it is, you might already have a lot of things set up, and you might not necessarily just need to use the specific GitHub action, or maybe you don't want to use the Biome GitHub action. You can easily just run it after you install your dependencies, just like we did locally. You can run that npm run lint. Now, finally, this one's probably going to be a little bit controversial, but we have Git Hooks, where Git Hooks allow you to run scripts at different points of the life cycle of a Git commit or that entire Git process, where one common way to do this is as a pre-commit hook. So what's going to happen is, say I write all my code and I go ahead and try to commit that code, I can run a script before that code is actually committed to make sure that I can do something like maybe I want to format that file to make sure when somebody's actually committing the code, it's already going to be formatted to the way that I want it to, rather than having to push that out to the PR and having that endless continuous loop of trying to fix it, going back, fixing it, going back. I get a shorter feedback loop for the code fixes that I need. Now, some people have reasons of why they don't like pre-commit hooks. One reason being that if you have to run that every single time, maybe it's going to block you if you're just trying to slam out code. But there's ways to get around that, such as like the no verify flag, and it's probably really going to depend on you and your team. Personally, I find a lot of value in that. That way, there's a shorter feedback loop. Somebody doesn't have to push out their changes just to find out that it fails. I like that it's going to automatically do that for you rather than having that conversation in the PR. But ultimately, again, it's up to you and your team to define how you want to set that up. But there's a couple tools that you can use if you want to set that up. And one of them that I like to use is Husky, where we can use that in tandem with something called Lint stage so that we can run a Git hook, particularly a pre-commit hook, anytime on our particularly staged files. So for instance, if we want to go ahead and install Husky, if I head over to get started, I can run npm install for that Husky package. So I'm going to go ahead and run that in my terminal. And then it's going to want me to run Husky init. So let's go ahead and run that as well. And if we head back over to our project, we can see that I have this new Husky folder, which is going to give me some stuff to work out of, where I currently have this npm that's being ran inside of the pre-commit. So if I make this npm -v, for instance, and I try to commit something like git commit -m test, we can see that it's not going to run anything, but we have my version here. So what I would want to do is inside of this, I want to run npm run format. So let's say if I go ahead and remove or add some of those spaces again, I messed some of this stuff up. And just to make sure that I don't format on save, I'm going to go ahead over to the settings and quickly get rid of this. I'm going to turn it back on in a second, but now I can save that page.tsx and I add all these files, commit, testing, adding, formatting. We can see what I'm just simply doing. We can see that it did run that formatting as soon as I tried to commit that file. Now, this is ultimately a good thing, right? Like I ran the formatting on all of my files and I do want to do that. But generally speaking, the way that I want to have this set up is I only want to run formatting on the files that I actually change. I don't want to run it on the entire project every single time. First of all, because maybe it's a little bit slower as my project gets bigger and bigger, but also I don't want to just stuff any single random formatting change inside of every single pull request any single time I make a random change. I only want that to go on the specific files that I changed inside of my change set. So that's where the lint stage package comes in, which is going to allow us to only run something on the actual staged files. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and copy this install command and paste that in my terminal. And as far as configuration, we're going to do two things. First of all, we can see inside of step number 2, inside of our pre-commit hook, we're going to simply just run the script lint stage, which is going to run what we set up inside of our package.json, where we're going to go ahead and set up a property inside of that, where we're going to say we want to run it on a specific file extension, and then we're going to run a script on that. So for instance, if we want to run it on TS or whatever files, we can run that specific script of every staged file that matches that extension. Now, of course, Biome has the recipe hooked up for us, so we can see that inside of the pre-commit, we're just going to run that lint staged. So first of all, I'm going to replace that. And then we can see that it also has the configuration for the package.json. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and copy everything, or rather just that property. I'm going to go ahead and paste it at the bottom of my package.json. Of course, we want to get rid of the comments because comments aren't valid JSON. We don't want to run this on all files, of course. We only want to run it on certain files, and you can customize this set of file extensions as whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to just make sure that this only specifies that I want to run it on the source files of my project. But then we can kind of figure out the settings that we want for wanting to run this. And in my case, it's going to be this second one where I want to write the files. And Biome mentions that you need to add this no errors on match every single time. Otherwise, you're going to have issues for how this is running. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of them around it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that code comment because, of course, that doesn't work. Or rather, I don't want to actually have this source here. I typically want to have it here, but because the way that lint stage is going to work, it's going to automatically apply the location for me. I don't want to actually add it there or else it's going to overwrite it. So what this is going to do is it's going to match all these file extensions, and then it's going to run this write command or the biome check write command, and then it's going to specify that location based off of that lint stage process. I'm also going to go ahead and run git checkout source to make sure that I remove all those files that were formatted. So now if I run git status, I have my happy settings, I have my package.json, I still have that change that I made to the page.tsx, I have my Husky files. So now if I try this again, if I add my files and testing the formatter, and let's run that page.tsx just to see in the background. If I now run that, we can see that it was formatted in the background. I ran all those tasks, which include that formatter, and we can see that it committed immediately after with those changed files. Now, again, I personally like having that pre-commit hook, but of course, make sure that you check in with you and your team, or if it's just you, depending on how you want to set that up, of how that's going to impact your day-to-day workflow. Now, if you want to learn how to build that full stack Next.js app complete with auth databases and payments, make sure you head over to spacejelly.dev/Next.js to get exclusive access and updates for my upcoming course. Now, one thing the formatter can't fix is how can you make sure your favicon is set up right and even supporting dark mode?